Ooh, one day I'll have the budget to have a Halloween costume.
Studio.
Happy Halloweeny, my beanies. This month I watched Nosferatu a couple times to bring you some fun spooky month content. While I'm busy editing my next long form video, I thought we could do something specifically for Halloween. So let's check out my Nosferat review of Robert Eager's 2024 Nosferatu. Really quick, I'm going to put trigger warnings on the screen, so if you're sensitive to spoilers or any of the following topics, feel free to skedaddle. We're going to be talking about survivorship, my experiences in palliative care, some brief mentions of cancer, harm coming to children, SA, precarious mental health, self-harm, death in general, and suicide. Also a little bit of gore. Obviously, there's going to be Nosferatu spoilers for 2024 and 1922, and we're going to talk a little bit about Bram Stoker's Dracula, as well as the Gary Oldman Dracula adaptation. So, trigger warning done, spoiler warning done. If you are ready, let us begin. Okay, first, a history lesson. When I was a wee lass, I was packed up onto a plane to sunny Silicon Valley, California, and on that plane, I watched the 1922 silent film by W Murnau, Nosferatu. If you're a fan of SpongeBob, you probably also were exposed to him when you were younger.
Nosferatu!
Having been born a huge vampire fan, I had already read Bram Stoker's Dracula, but I was unfamiliar with Count Orlok's game. If you watched Eager's Nosferatu, you probably noticed that it all feels very Dracula-esque, although Lucy is conspicuously missing. This is because Nosferatu began life as a copyright-dodging attempt at making a German-version Dracula movie. And if you're wondering, yes, Bram Stoker's estate did successfully sue them for their attempts. Now, we could talk forever about the insane lore of the adaptation of Nosferatu. For starters, an intertitle found on Nosferatu acknowledges that he is based on Dracula. The film was simultaneously made in English and German at the same time, and if you want to chuckle, you can look into Werner Herzog's memoirs when he talks about smuggling mummies out of Guanajuato Museum to film the opening scenes before slipping them back into place ahead of the museum's morning opening. This is, of course, for the 1979 version of the film. The plot of Nosferatu, the original, and the most recent iteration are largely the same. They retain the main plot points of Dracula as well as Dracula's archetypes, notably, of course, Dracula, who is Orlok, Jonathan Harker, who is Thomas Hutter, Mina, who is Ellen, and Van Helsing, which in Eager's Nosferatu is von Franz. Nosferatu began life as a German Dracula conveniently located in the German town of Wisburg so as to allow German audiences to connect more fully to the story. Do you think I said German enough? Okay, final warning for 2024 Nosferatu spoilers. Nosferatu's original plot has a stunning lack of a vampire-hunting witch doctor, a la von Franz, who is Eager's creation. Instead, things unfold as they do in the modern adaptation. Ellen and Thomas share something of a mind link, which allows Ellen to begin sleepwalking in response to her husband being preyed on by Orlok, as he finds himself trapped in the castle deep within the Carpathian Mountains. Like in Dracula, Jonathan, or Thomas, are the hapless victims sent to sell real estate to a nefarious, half-dead wizard man whom they slowly put together as a vampire ahead of making their escape. The addition of the mental link between Thomas and Ellen is interesting, as Jonathan and Mina have no means of metaphysically communicating in the beginning of Dracula. As always, the vampire gets loaded onto a ship and brought to the New World, where he immediately starts causing trouble. Another Nosferatu-specific detail is the use of plague-carrying rats to infest the city. Bonus points here for Nosferatu's retelling of who Thomas's boss actually is. Herr Nock, like in the modern adaptation, canonically goes insane and is confined to an asylum. In 1922, he's cured of madness at the end of the movie following the Nosferatu's death. In 2024, he's staked through the heart. In Stoker's Dracula, Harker's boss, Peter Hawkins, is just an estate agent. There's no proper explanation given as to why or how Dracula got in touch with him, and so the reimagining of Thomas's boss, Herr Nock, as a minion of the damned is a fun addition. It gives us some plausible start-to-finish backstory as to how Orlok even manages to get a hold of Ellen's husband and ultimately Ellen. With the addition of Van Helsing's character archetype, the modern Nosferatu wraps up much more conveniently, whereas the original Nosferatu took a page out of the book of female agency and street smarts. If you read Dracula, you probably noticed Mina does a lot of sleuthing, and without her the gang would be wholly incapable of identifying Dracula as a vampire, surmising his escape, or following him back to Transylvania to ultimately kill him. Similarly, the original Ellen ushers in the story's ending by tricking Thomas into leaving the house so she can independently invite Orlok into her room. She reads, behind her husband's back, about the Nosferatu's weakness, that a pure maiden can lure him into her bedroom until sunrise, and, tricking Thomas into leaving the house, as the sun rises, Orlok, having been seduced by Ellen, turns into a puff of smoke, and so she saves Wisburg essentially on her own. Robert Eggers von Franz is a pretty clear stand-in for Van Helsing, who is canonically Dutch, by the way. He's weird and eccentric and shows up at the last possible moment as Dracula blows into port via the ghost ship Demeter. Nosferatu does this too. These two seemingly bumbling weirdo Germanic doctors diagnose Lucy and Ellen, respectively. Van Helsing is summoned by Seward, the doctor looking after half-vampirized Lucy, and von Franz is summoned by Sieves, who hits a wall after chloroforming Ellen and running out of options. The Victorians. If you haven't seen Eggers' Nosferatu and you're confused, the main changes made by the appearance of von Franz are that instead of Ellen advancing the plot on her own, we now have a handy exposition machine that follows everybody around, and affirms that we're dealing with a vampire. It's the same shtick as Van Helsing, except that we don't have a Lucy Westenra to drip-feed us vampirism's symptoms. In the case of Nosferatu, we really only have Ellen as a female mouthpiece through which to understand our main antagonist. Okay, now, big departures in Eggers' Nosferatu adaptation and the original do exist, and they're worth talking about. Originally, in 1922, Ellen's metaphysical connection to her husband did not also extend to Orlok. Nosferatu's assault, and keep that word in mind, of Thomas as his bona fide blood bag is implied to be so horrible, so violating, that his other sexual partners, like his wife, can feel it too. And if you're a Victorian enjoyer like I am, you're probably tickled pink at the great set dressing and immersive nature of the fictional Wisburg Victorian society. Victorian ideals are a great backdrop against which to pick apart modesty, consent, and the pitfalls of a truly sexually astringent society. That's right, it's going to be one of those videos. In Eggers' Nosferatu, Ellen summons Nosferatu as a child out of loneliness, and she clearly has some kind of preordained metaphysical gift, at the very least future-telling as she describes it to von Franz. Nosferatu's quest is entirely informed by his desire to take Ellen from Thomas, as opposed to Dracula's original quest of just establishing a new base of power somewhere where there's plenty of victims to go around. The idea of vampire reincarnation love stories came much later, as Dracula originally only really targets Mina because he wants revenge on Jonathan. I would like to blame Gary Oldman's Dracula for the fixation we now have on vampires as misunderstood lovers through time. Although, to be fair, I owe you guys a video on the proto-vampire and noted lesbian Carmilla, so my opinion is subject to change.
Here we go, lesbians!
In the original Nosferatu, Ellen is psychically victimized by said Nosferatu and takes it upon herself of her own accord to scheme his death. There's no implied love story in either fictional works unless you count Dracula's weird daughter-wife relationship to the Weird Sisters. Vampires in their early incarnations are all explicitly incapable of human love, but they are implied to be capable of fixation, obsession, and lust. And more specifically, technical incest, and if you want to talk more about that, check out my Auri Village Lore review. Her story hinges on Ellen the same way that Murnau's Nosferatu's does. Eggers actually expands the social atmosphere around Ellen. She's entrusted to her husband's friends, Friedrich Harding and his pregnant wife Anna, whom in the original adaptation are simply just the one Harding, who notices Ellen sleepwalking while Thomas is away. In the recent film, the Hardings have a deeper connection to Ellen, summoning other characters like Sieves and leading directly to the need for von Franz to exist at all. Thomas, by the way, like Jonathan, is a hilariously bumbling moron who constantly self-sabotages and lands himself deeper and deeper into Orlok's clutches. This man has never made a good decision in his life, which is great for me because I got in a good laugh here and there. Another fun caveat is the prevalence of Ellen's connection to Orlok. Because he's pursuing her specifically, she and Nock, Thomas's boss, go through the same ripples of madness together. Although for Ellen, she's less so going insane and instead afflicted with seizures, wheezing, sleepwalking, fits, and psychosexual spells where she doesn't feel pain, which is kind of fun. In Dracula, Mina drives the plot forward by intuiting Dracula is on a ship back to Transylvania, and she does this because Dracula forces her to drink his blood, creating a psychic link between them. Ellen has a very much more extreme version of this. She's implied to be so powerful that she wakes up a centuries-old dormant vampire, Orlok, just by virtue of pretty please asking for a friend. The events of Eger's Nosferatu are actually Ellen's fault, just not intentionally. She's simply too metaphysically powerful for her own good. And I like the implication that vampires can share a hive mind, by the way. I think that's very cool. Also worth noting is that in 1922, Orlok does note Thomas's wife's picture that he keeps on his person. He notes that she has a beautiful neck. In the 2024 adaptation, he steals the good luck charm that Ellen's made for Thomas, since obviously, he really is only interested in her. There is much to say about the presence of Von Franz and the characterization of Ellen in this movie. I'd like to caveat, by the way, to mention how good of an actress Lily Rose Depp is. I'm not up to date with my Lily Rose lore, other than that weird show with The Weeknd, but she kills it in this movie. Performance of the year. The movie is worth the watch just to see her have fake seizures and contortion herself and drool and roll her eyes back into her head Exorcist style. Eger's creation of an occultist vampire hunter should come to us as no surprise. Nosferatu is a German expressionist film based on Dracula, and there is no character more compulsively reimagined to death than Van Helsing.
Are there any other
Van Helsings
I should know about?
Meow.
I'm a big fan of Willem Dafoe playing a weird little freak who is flung into a situation. Van Helsing is a staunch Catholic character in Dracula, or so Den of Geek would have us believe, but Eger is based Von Franz partially on the occultist Albin Grau, who helped produce Murnau's Nosferatu. I think this is a fun character addition to Nosferatu. My only notes are that he's a little unnecessary. The twist of Murnau's Ellen is that she defeats Nosferatu of her own volition. Eger's Ellen intuits that she needs to defeat Orlok, and Von Franz is the handy trump card that essentially lures the men far away on a fake vampire hunting mission so that Ellen can be alone with Orlok. Which I guess is fine, but I don't know if it was necessary. Thomas sees Nosferatu is a vampire. They have a pretty good grasp on the cause and effect of seeing a mysterious plague ship at the same time Orlok is in town and visiting Ellen in the night. It's not exactly a mystery. Von Franz ultimately doesn't do anything other than prove by jamming a stake into Ellen's wrist and forcing her to speak in demon tongues that she's having a spiritual trance state. Specifically to convince Harding that Sieves is right in his hunch that Ellen isn't just having seizures. So again, he's a conduit for exposition, I guess, but also, I love Willem Dafoe, so I can't really be mad about his role in this movie. As I said earlier, you get a good sense of the various chokeholds that Victorian times had people in throughout this movie. There's a point where Harding goes to kiss his pregnant wife Anna, and she chastises him for trying to smooch her in public. There's a lot of Catholic imagery, long billowy hair, an emphasis on purity culture, but also an undercurrent of horniness. Victorian society is interesting because while incredibly astringent, it was also a time of technological and scientific advancement. People were interested in occultism, spiritualism, clairvoyance, hypnotism, trance states. People endeavored to understand death, i.e. the memento mori. Gothic horror titles were doing great, a la Christmas Carol and Wuthering Heights. It was a time of the occult imagination running wild. Von Franz cuts into the very astringent characters who are staunch and Catholic, like Anna or Harding, the same way the underbelly of Victorian values cuts through the illusion of propriety. The Victorians were politically conservative Catholic, valuing order, politeness, prudishness, and societal conventions, and yet they were also fascinated with ghosts, death, and the extremely horny. Queen Victoria, for whom the time period is named, was voraciously randy. Her and her husband Albert had erotic art, furniture, diary, and crazy snogging all over the damn place. She's noted historically as being a terrible mom. She basically saw her children as the unfortunate byproduct of her favorite hobby, which we will remember as getting it on. But as you can see, there's something of a notable tonal shift, right, between the imagery of the perfect Victorian outside versus the ghost shagging inside. Von Franz is the underbelly, whereas the other characters in Ellen's life are more so classically Victorian and prudish. If von Franz and Orlok represent the occultism of the time, then Ellen and Thomas represent the sexual anxieties and secrecy of a time period which only allowed romantic expression under the providence of God and in the confines of a marriage. Speaking of which, if you watch Nosferatu, you undoubtedly noticed it's quite so very sexed up. There's a difference, I think, between sensuality and overt sexuality. Sensuality often is duplicitous in the way that it leads us to the sex. It's like a feeling or an instinct, a suggestion. It could border on the romantic or the animalistic, but sensuality, by definition, is an expression of pleasurable pursuit. Sensuality, I feel, is more so in your face. It's the undulating nudity, unbridled ravenousness of animals doing what animals do best. And usually it lacks pomp and circumstance. There's no romance or foreplay in Nosferatu, which helps the sex to be more shocking and off-putting. It knocks you on your butt, with the virulent and quick way it's unveiled, happens, and then abruptly stops. Nosferatu is not sensual. It's constantly alluding to sex. In many cases, it's showing it to you. Everybody in this movie keeps saying, "He's coming," while uncomfortably undulating and moaning and simulating the physical motion of humping. Nock tells Nosferatu to quote-unquote use him. Orlok tells Ellen he shall taste of her, and curiously Orlok is always biting people not on the neck, but rather on the heart. If sexual acts are linked to intimacy, the desires of the heart that hinge on sensuality, goodness, togetherness, and romantic love, how does that factor into a monster who is admittedly incapable of feeling love? The exploration of Ellen's psychic link to Thomas and Orlok is fleshed out in great detail in Eager's Adaptation. It hinges on a specific implication made in 1922. The heinousness of Orlok's assault on Thomas is so fundamentally destabilizing, and perhaps intimate, that it affects his wife, the only other person we can assume he's been intimate with. In my notes, I labeled this section under Orlok suckin' Thomas freaky style. In 1922, Orlok comes to Thomas at night, a departure from Dracula simply toying with Jonathan Harker. Orlok feeds on Thomas, who blacks out as it happens. In the second instance, he cowers under his bed covers and passes out, and so Ellen begins sleepwalking. The feeding is so intimate, changing the very landscape of Thomas's personhood so completely that it affects his other intimate partner. Nosferatu is interesting in its approach to the vampire mythos, as it frames vampirism very clearly like sex, as opposed to Dracula, which frames it as an intricate method of reproduction. Vampirism is almost like an STD. It changes the victim so dramatically that it starts to affect their other partners. And so, if vampirism is like an STD, is the feeding on humans the sexual act? People in the 20s would have been familiar, at least, with venereal disease like syphilis and gonorrhea, which were a prevalent issue. Syphilis is best known for its sore-like gummas, soft tumor-like growths which indicate the late stages of syphilis and give the afflicted an appearance which looks like they're rotting in real time. Orlok is visibly maggot-infested and half-rotten throughout Nosferatu. Visually and contextually, vampirism operates like an STD. Magnified in the 2024 film, even in the brief moment of Ellen's sleepwalking in 1922, we're urged to conclude that there is a hive mind-esque element to vampirism, but that its sexuality, not sensuality, is brutal and separate from romantic affection. Remember what Dracula tells Jonathan Harker, but perhaps his harem of weird sisters remember his love from the past. In 2024, Ellen frequently wheezes, her breaths becoming raspy and sickly among the strange moans and sighs of a woman engrossed in a sexual encounter. Her breathing becomes like the Count's. She's not only possessed by him, she's becoming like him too, infected, it seems, with a parasite of the mind and the soul, resembling this rotted, syphilitic corpse. Consumption imagery is alive and well in the vampiric world. In Dracula, Lucy Westenra, and by extension her corpse, is often operatically likened to a frail and beautiful tuberculosis victim. The Victorians placed great importance on the visual hallmarks of the chronically ill and dying. Pale skin, languid disposition, fainting very daintily, the sickly Ellen, or the sickly Lucy, are at home in the Victorian era as vampirism acts like consumption, a brutal and deadly but also weirdly venerated illness for the period. Many characters in Gothic horror books die tragically, but also nobly and beautifully, of consumption. And if you want a third story, which is well known for its vampire mythos and the presence of TB bacteria, you might want to pick up a copy of Jane Eyre. Vampirism and chronic illness, I think, go hand in hand. In Dracula, the transformation into a vampire is gradual. It's a descent into a host of physical and psychological symptoms, which end in death and then life after death. Lily Rose's acting does an amazing job of showcasing what it would be like, outside the metaphysical, to have a chronic illness, like epilepsy, during a time when medical science could not quite comprehend why or how this happened. When Severs is talking about treating Ellen, he mentions she has excess blood and needs to sleep corseted so as to contain her uterus and the excess blood it's producing. The lore is, if nothing else, all immersive of its time period. This makes the connotation between vampirism and STDs especially heinous, doesn't it? Vampirism, the affliction, is unable to be explained. It's lumped in with the hysterical ravings of womanish problems. And speaking of hysterical ravings, I think Lily Rose's portrayal of Ellen is absolutely amazing. There's a point after she speaks to Von Franz, once the demons are done, possessing her, and she writhes and temporarily breaks the spell of seizing to scream, "Help me," and implore the men around her to do something in a brief moment of clarity. When I was in palliative care, I was not having the usual super up time that a cancer patient would generally have. Instead, as somebody who's sedative and painkiller intolerant, I was suffering as chunks of my liquefied insides poured out of an artificially drilled hole in my lower abdomen, and I would scream and writhe, a la Lily Depp, and beg the doctors to kill me, and I would absolutely scream, "Help me," while imploring God to end my suffering. The screaming went on so often, and it was so loud and agonized, that nurses in the ICU, a floor away, would report that they could hear it. The nurse who mentioned it sounded so frightened and disturbed that her voice was shaking and she was tearing up as she told me how scary and harrowing it was to hear the endless cries of a woman essentially begging, echoing through the hospital halls, for death. Crimes against the innocent, and more specifically children, are a recurring theme in vampire media. Dracula features a lot of child and baby murder, mainly as an allegory for how vampirism steals the innocence of its unlucky victims. When Orlok attacks Thomas in Eager's retelling, it's interesting to note what a visual emphasis is put on Orlok's genitals. Despite usually being clothed, Orlok appears to sleep and feed in the nude. When he attacks Thomas, it's jarring because he's naked. He sinks his teeth into him, undulating in a humping motion. The scene is prolonged and deeply disturbing. If you remove the blood-sucking, he's essentially a Thomas. And I think this is the point. Vampirism is rape. And if we accept that it is also like an STD, such a sickness being knowingly passed on through assault has an even darker connotation. The scene of Thomas being openly fed on, cognizant he's being attacked, realizing what's happening as it unfolds and being powerless to stop it, is deeply disturbing. It sets the tone for the message of Nosferatu. And with the themes of SA in mind, let us turn our attention again to children. Ellen describes the start of her relationship with Orlok in the following manner. "I was but a child," and indeed she was. There's a lot of thematic use of children as clairvoyant in this movie, but there's also a lot of harm that follows them. The Harding children's constant anxieties about monsters under the bed is good foreshadowing, as Anna reassures her children she will not let any monstrous harm come to them, only for them to be murdered in the end alongside herself. Anna's unborn baby is also killed, which begs an interesting question. Why do vampires oppose children, thematically? I suppose it's because logically, children represent youth and potential, and vampires are somewhat trapped in a purgatorial stasis. But children are often synonymous with innocence, especially young children and babies. Children are more often depicted as clairvoyant or magical, and in real life, many cultures consider babies to be most spiritually close to the other side. Fresh out of the realm of heaven and incarnated on earth, they are not yet corrupted. There is additional context to the connection between vampirism and children. In the white horse scene, Thomas, feverishly observing what he calls a gypsy custom, witnesses a naked woman on a white horse sidling up to a grave. Within it is the body of a vampire. This scene is framed interestingly as half of a nightmare that Thomas is experiencing, but half lived reality. The mythos in Eastern Europe being that a white horse symbolizing purity would not tread on a vampire's grave, leading its hunters right to it in order to destroy it. But while the movie uses a naked woman, this would originally have been a young boy or girl, and this, of course, was to ensure the horse rider was a virgin. I think this is interesting for two reasons. If vampirism is a sexual evil, more specifically akin to an STD, it makes sense that the horse, white for purity, and its virginal rider would be spiritually opposed to something like a Nosferatu, completely unable to even tread across it. These two things are fundamentally different. The second reason is, again, that vampires and children are also diametrically opposed. The mythos of Nosferatu, which is just a blanket term for the undead, actually gives context into the mythos of Dracula. Dracula is fueled by spite. He tries to kill Nina to spite Jonathan, and perhaps he feeds on babies, and Lucy feeds on children in order to spite their spiritual enemy. Youth, purity, and a divine connection to the benevolent are popular foils to evil, but also popular draws for said evil. Evil seeks to corrupt, to gain dominion over that which is pure and good, and since there is no greater evil than the vampire, the undead who denounce the supposedly benevolent Christian god, children are a great contender for things a Nosferatu might despise. Vampirism and harm coming to children exist in almost every retelling of the classic Dracula story, even down to Resident Evil Village. And seriously, go watch the lore review. If indeed virginity is the foil to the vampire's existence, it gives us even more of a basis to assume that the Nosferatu is a sexual evil. Those who have not yet come into contact with sex exist to destroy it. And honestly, that's kind of Victorian too, isn't it? Anna herself is the visual foil to Ellen. Often clad in white, Anna is always looking like a bride with her little veil. She is, in some ways, our Lucy. She's blonde and married and conforms well to societal conventions. She's round-eyed and loving to a fault, taking great care of Ellen and constantly affirming the love she has for her. Anna appears in most cases within proximity of a cross. There's a scene where Ellen is sleeping next to her in bed, ironically the night she reassures her children no monster will get them, moments before she's possessed by the blood plague, and Ellen looks completely out of place. Everything around Anna is soft and white, cross firmly in her hands, and Ellen is pictured askew, cloying like a darkness closing in, barely able to touch the cross, one eye visible, not quite fitting in Anna's bed somehow. When she awakens on the floor, being devoured by rats, her cross is left unguarded and alone on her pillow. The Catholic safety net against the Nosferatu is gone. It's interesting to note post-assault, Thomas finds refuge among Romanian nuns who exorcise him to free him from Orlok's influence. The abandonment of Catholic iconography is both a classic vampire thing, but also visually striking as the cue that Victorian morality and purity cannot coexist with the perverse occult and sexual nature of the vampire. If we accept that vampirism can also be about violence towards women in the context of matrimony, shackling them, in this case, to men, and becoming property, metaphysically possessed and literally possessed, Ellen meeting Orlok in a sham of a bridal outfit at the end makes a lot of sense too. If we consider the role of matrimony in a society like the Victorians, where it's basically a gateway into being made respectable, Ellen obviously doesn't want to redo this oath to Orlok and renounce her love and God-sanctioned marriage to Thomas. Editing spaz here. Okay, so in my quest to learn more about Nosferatu, I forgot that I bookmarked an interview with Robert Eggers talking about the deleted scene that would have tacked on 4 more minutes to the movie. In it, essentially, Anna and Friedrich are getting busy in their marital bed, and they're interrupted by Ellen waking up to sleepwalk. And the reason that I think this is interesting is that, again, it's showing that there's an interruption in this sort of idyllic Catholic Victorian marriage, and the interruption is not only just the presence of Ellen, but the possession by Orlok, right? Because without that possession, there's no reason for her to be sleepwalking in the first place. Nosferatu isn't necessarily associated with Victorianism by any means, considering it's an expressionist German film. But Robert Eggers knows what he's doing when it comes to immersing us, I think, in this sort of weird Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Victorian period. The film is very Jane Eyre, which I appreciate. It's very Wuthering Heights. It's all about the divide between the very actual, perverse, occult infliction of vampirism versus all of these sort of telltale signs of God's providence and Catholic love. And I think that that scene should have been kept in the movie because it really goes the extra mile to illustrate why we get to know Anna and Friedrich Harding at all. They are essentially the foil to what Ellen and Orlok and now Thomas have got going on. Anyways, I just think the interruption of their sort of Catholic, God-approved lovemaking by a possessed, insane occult woman was interesting, and I wanted to share. But she must for the literal good of an entire city and possibly the world. By betraying her desires and entering into the sham marriage with a Nosferatu, she's ensuring he stops plaguing the town, killing off women and children. It's an unholy and self-sacrificing avenue towards safety and ensuring that future generations will make it. And in a sense, isn't the transactional nature of marriage like this as well? How many female relatives do you know who did not have the chance to work or attend school because they were marked as baby makers from the moment of birth? Women bear the brunt of many societal evils, and especially sexual evils, whether they like it or not, in order to bear future generations who might hopefully be free. Eggers' Nosferatu has a lot to say about the social status of women, especially through Friedrich Harding, Anna's husband. Whereas Anna is unyieldingly patient and loving towards Ellen, Ellen confronts Friedrich and asserts that he hates her. He says he's been nothing but nice, to which she sarcastically replies, "By tying me up?" referencing him tying her to the bed in order to avoid nighttime fits. Friedrich doesn't directly antagonize Ellen. He pays for her expenses, he keeps her in his house, he fetches Sieves and von Franz, and basically takes over her care while Thomas is gone. And yet, male care and male cruelty belong together in Robert Eggers' Victorian society. Friedrich, quote-unquote, helps her by tying her up, allowing doctors to corset her uncomfortably to sleep, to shove huge needles in her wrist. He's constantly betraying Ellen's body by allowing restriction and containment and harm, and yet he cares. But Friedrich is also always underhandedly shitting on women. He calls Ellen a blackguard, he tells her mind is diseased, that she brings plague which kills his daughter and wife, while affirming Thomas that none of this concerns him. But by and large, this is also kind of Thomas's fault, right? Why wouldn't you heed the warning of your magical prophet wife, who has extensively warned you unspeakable evil awaits him on his business trip by not going into the Romanian steppe alone? And until Thomas shows Friedrich his bite marks from the Nosferatu, Friedrich is convinced, like everybody else, that the vampirism is brought on by the shortcomings of a woman. Femininity is deeply connected to evil, and why shouldn't it be, considering society's continued attitudes towards restraining and containing female freedom? I also want to point out that if indeed we read Thomas' assault as an allegory for sexual violence, the implication in not blaming him for the Nosferatu arriving in town is that rape isn't a man's issue, because none of this supernatural meandering could have happened to a man like Thomas, i.e. rape doesn't happen to men, right? And obviously, it does. We know it does. But a prominent issue addressed by feminists for years is the shifting cultural tide that frames the sexual assault of men as non-existent. In Friedrich's mind, Thomas isn't the problem. He couldn't possibly have been assaulted by a Nosferatu and bring the blood plague. Ellen is the problem. She's a blackguard. She's diseased. She brings plague. She speaks to demons. The more we question Ellen and point the finger, the more we wander into the "what were you wearing on the night you were assaulted" territory. Friedrich operates in his disregard of Thomas's experience while condemning Ellen's as somebody who discounts the possibility that men can be victimized by the Nosferatu, who we will remember is an allegory for rape. Sex is synonymous with evil, to Victorians at least, so long as it occurs outside marriage. But in Nosferatu, it is also synonymous with evil in the context of marriage. Interestingly, by insisting it's a demonic union, this tells us sex outside the providence of God is what leads to the spread of disease and the violation of boundaries and consent, which, ironically, is also the message of Jane Eyre, so Victorian context points to Eagers for that. The vampirism makes monsters, but not necessarily other Nosferatus, of those who come into contact with it. Friedrich, overcome with grief, finds the dead body of his wife in her mausoleum. He dies while inside her and is found dead laying on top of her. Their bodies are burned to prevent the blood plague spreading, but this is an interesting parallel of the treatment of newfound vampires in Dracula. In a way, both Harding man and wife are our Lucy Westenra's. They are changed and corrupted by Orlok's influence. They just don't also become vampires. Friedrich's cruelty furthers the narrative that monstrosity begets monsters, more specifically creates rapists. Criminality often is born of less than desirable circumstances. Psychologists often talk of breeding grounds for psychopathy, authoritarian parents, isolation, a stringent daily life, psychosexual abuse. All who are touched by the Nosferatu's effects are fundamentally changed, at risk of assaulting others themselves. There is a meditation on the treatment of women, how even as corpses we are not safe, how we have to be selfless to a fault to keep societies in existence, usually at the risk of our lives. How we have to accept the violence that is given to us, and how we're so pitiable and laughable that men who are victimized become, as women once violated. It doesn't happen to men, and if they say that it does, they're weak. Ellen even blames Thomas for his own assault. Quote, "You fell into his arms as a swooning lily of a woman." Doesn't it feel a lot like the "what were you wearing, why were you out so late" argument? But if being assaulted makes you a swooning lily of a woman, do women then solely exist to be violated? The implication here is that there is a definition for the condition of being a woman, that condition being violation. If we accept the crimes of sexual nature are more so about power and control, sadism instead of passionate desire, it fits with Orlok's motives for wanting to have Ellen at all. He cannot love. He doesn't feel a romantic attraction for her. He just has this desire for dominance. He's biting her heart, ruining a place synonymous with love and affection. Victorian-era heart symbolism had much to do with romance, commitment, devotion, and a heart locket full of hair could be traded between friends, family, lover, and as a token of devotional mourning. Ellen talks about her relationship to Orlok like a partner who commits DV. She says that it started off sweet and then became torturous, and falling in love with Thomas frees her from her shame. She tells Thomas of Orlok, quote, "He is my shame. He took me as his lover." Notice that she doesn't say, "He took me as his wife." His lover has sexual connotation. In the opening scene, when we first see a glimpse of Ellen's possession, she lets out a little "oh," and has a quasi-orgasmic experience. Orlok's possession of her has nothing to do with love, and he admits as much, doesn't he? He tells her that he cannot love. Rather, he's all about control. "I am an appetite," he says, and yet he, quote, "cannot be sated without Ellen." Throughout the movie, both Ellen and Thomas speak about Orlok as if they're recounting an experience where an intimate partner assaulted them. In Thomas's case, a senseless act of violence, and in Ellen's case, a relationship gone wrong. When Ellen speaks of her nightmares ending with Thomas and how she chooses him over Orlok despite their metaphysical bond, reads as somebody discovering healthy love and choosing a new life in spite of their trauma. There's an important scene when Ellen flips over the bookshelf after being kicked out of the Harding residence for infesting them with blood plague, where she and Thomas confront the reality of the Nosferatu having been summoned purposefully by Ellen as a child. Thomas will later describe his experience, quote, "seeing the devil firsthand" in relation to seeing what Orlok truly was, but he says that he cannot speak of what the Nosferatu did to him, and I feel that this language is very essay-coded as well. A crime so horrible and so deeply unsettling and senselessly violent that he cannot bring himself to talk about it. This scene is what cements the idea that vampirism is connected directly to. Ellen begins her monologue by chastising Thomas for going against her premonitions to not go to the Carpathian Mountains. She then has a seizure, because of course, and things get interesting when she insists, "I'll be good," while on her knees, and crawls to Thomas while licking and nuzzling his arm. She then drops the line that's been memed to hell and back, "You could never please me as he could." And essentially, she's egging Thomas on to roughly have sex with her so as to let Orlok, quote, "see their love." The scene ping-pongs us between Ellen hopelessly recounting her summoning of the Nosferatu, chastising Thomas for leaving her in pursuit of material gain, chastising Thomas for swooning like a lily of a woman, and essentially voiding their marriage accidentally for a sack of gold. And then coming onto him in a way which is, I think, textbook hysterical. The scene is uncomfortable, rowdy, it's a roller coaster of emotion where you can't really guess where we're headed thematically. Ellen is actually submissive, then domineering, practically egging her husband on to rape her, and this is fictionalized hysteria, this off-putting characterization of two people talking in code about assault by the same man reads like a glimpse into a trauma response. And the trauma response of using rough sex to mimic SA is an act of self. Then Thomas, victim of and participant in said SA, ends the affair by telling Ellen she's safe with him, that he won't ever let Orlok hurt her again. He comforts her again as a man who inflicts cruelty and cares, curing it with an equal level of women as blackguards. Unable to unsteep them both from the victimhood brought on by Orlok's perverse appetite. Ellen ends the scene by exclaiming to keep away from her, for she is unclean, having intercourse before marriage with a monster possessed by a demon and dabbling in occult arts, a sexual, social, and societal mix of taboos piled onto one another. Ellen is not the blood plague, she is its victim, and in her dying moments her thighs are smeared with blood like a miscarriage or a period, the civil uncleanliness of womanhood, its horrible spectre, perverting the land on which she lives and pooling as a plague in a sham marital bed. And it's uncomfortable because it's real. The confusion, the desire for the man that she chooses, the devolving into self-harm through controlled SA, the name-calling, the victim-blaming. In her confrontation with Orlok, she calls him the serpent that's been crawling within her, and Orlok tells her that it isn't him, it's her own nature, that love is inferior to her. And yet she persists. "I love Thomas." There is an emphasis on how Ellen is not of humankind, how Orlok has deigned that she is of his kind. If we read this conversation as that of a victim and her abuser, Orlok has stolen Ellen's personhood, as SA often does for its victims. He's blaming her for the assault on her mind and body. She is no longer worthy of love. It is inferior to her. He's not the serpent that crawls within. Note here that a serpent is pretty phallic, right? It's her nature. The assault is her fault. Orlok is an appetite and nothing more, and literally so. He is an appetite for perversion and destruction. He lives to suck the life out of others. He isn't just a perpetrator. Rather, look how easily he turns the entire cast of characters against each other. He is incarnate. He is the appetite for sadistic domination over the weak, and his blood plague simply rips those urges out of people, causing them to act, causing Friedrich to lift his wife's dead body, causing Ellen to chastise her husband at becoming womanly once asleep, causing Thomas to brutally have sex with his own wife in revenge of feeling inferior to the Nosferatu, causing Herr Nock to bite the head off live animals and kill men. Orlok calls Ellen his affliction. He insists all this is her fault for waking him up from his grave. This who has no regard for human life is blaming his victim for his actions. "I didn't hit you. Look what you made me do. You made me do this to kill all these people. You're not worthy of love. It's inferior to you. You're like me and therefore don't belong to true love." And Thomas. Often it'd want us to get in the mud with them, to retaliate so they can point to what we do in self-defense and say, "See, you're crazy, you're being aggressive. I didn't drive you to retaliate, you're just being nuts. You don't deserve a normal life. Stay here with me instead. You're damaged goods. Nobody will ever love you because you're unclean." And like Ellen, victims internalize that dialogue. She says it herself. She is unclean. Users sow doubt into the minds of their victims when people are nice to them or attempt to help them out of their situation. They isolate those victims, managing their friendships, intentionally stirring trouble to get people to cut the victim off. It is a very insidious process. The way abusers weasel into your subconscious thoughts about your own self is calculated and cruel. It's like the blood plague. It's like the descent into vampirism. Not unfolding all at once, but gradually until you're syphilitic and no longer yourself. Orlok implores her, remember how we once were, a moment, just remember for a moment, and there's love to do this. The remember the good old days trick, pulling at the heartstrings to make you forget abuse, gaslighting, love bombing. Orlok's basically doing it all. When she's quarreling with Thomas, she describes herself as loathsome and base. Ellen has internalized that she is responsible for Orlok's violence, hence he is my shame, he is my melancholy. And the scene reads to me as a woman telling her new chosen partner of her ex. Ellen's describing PTSD, isn't she? He stalks me in the night and all my sleeping thoughts are of him. She seizes and convulses. She gets on her knees and rips at her dress. She cries and drools. She flips over bookshelves and chastises Thomas for swooning like a lily woman at his own advances. And then, as Thomas moves to help her, calling for Sievers, she fawns. I'll be good. She goes right for his junk. You could never please me as he could. And Thomas looks upon her so vilely, so full of rage, that he immediately moves to rape his own wife. Orlok is an appetite for perverse destruction, and yet Ellen begs Thomas to rape her, to kiss her hard, to hurt her, to let Orlok see their love, and then back to convulsing. She's asking Thomas to replay the brutal assaults of Orlok on her body and mind, and if you've ever been in the same position as Ellen, perhaps you're aware of how hypersexuality and self-harm follow in the wake of this type of abuse. How we can convince ourselves that we're deserving of punishment, that we do like it and we do invite it even, because the pain is now familiar. Nervous systems so used to being on fire that the moment things are soft and gentle, we begin in fact to lose our minds and crave the suffering. Quote, without you I will become a demon, she tells Thomas, convulsing once more as if Orlok has taken over the sexual onslaught. And perhaps he has, having reduced Ellen to an echo of her traumas. Without Thomas, her chosen partner, her safe partner, she will become a demon, bound indeed to a Nosferatu, becoming like him, a living display of brutality and violation. But Thomas reassures her, it's me, I love you, he won't hurt you. Ellen is essentially having a flashback describing a memory, but it's cloaked by a metaphysical experience on screen. If we remove the symbolic possession, though, she's clearly showing PTSD, right? She doesn't know who or where she is. She's being controlled by the shame of her memories, and perhaps if we accept that that is the case, we can also wonder if when she says, let him see our love, she's actually talking to Orlok. As in, let Thomas see the way you make love to me. Brutally, horribly. Because she's unclean and base, and this is what she deserves. Even Thomas should hurt her, because the hurt is her personal shame. Hence, let Thomas see hers and Orlok's, definition of love. It's very disturbing to think about, because it's real. PTSD and sexual violence skew our perception of ourselves, of what's healthy, of the world and our place in it. It's the type of crime that informs the rest of your life, because it becomes the backdrop for all your decisions. PTSD is a fuse that lights itself no matter what you do, and you barely have any control over when or where. Could be a nightmare, could be a flashback, could be a trigger. You may never know what's coming, and you have to deal with it. You have to move on from it, work with it, work around it, heal from something you didn't break. It's a plethora of unknowns and burden that you take on in order to continue to be a whole human being, despite everything that's happened thus far. And there are those who will never return to the land of the living, who will be stuck in their trauma responses, choosing unhealthy coping mechanisms which may make things worse. And they could have been perfectly whole human beings if not for the Orlok in their lives. The perverse appetite which births the blood plague of horrors onto its unsuspecting victims. Women, children, men, innocents, even animals. We become changelings, as Ellen describes, flipping between our traumatized self and our unhealthy entrapments, and the us that we want to become, choosing our Thomases and dealing with our Orloks. Quote, "We must know evil to be able to destroy it. We must discover it in ourselves. As a victim, the evil is the wake of the crime, and we destroy it by moving on and rebuilding. We recognize its lingering in ourselves, and that is the PTSD. We can't murder the victim's self, but we can recognize the inference of evil within and destroy it in the world by going on to live our best life." Throughout the bookshelf scene, I noted interestingly that the patterns of Ellen's clothes never quite sync. If you look closely at the stripes on her dress, they don't connect. She's always askew even in her attire. Even raggedy, traumatized Thomas, sweaty and barely clothed, isn't quite so asymmetrical. And I stared and stared at this screen grab. Why? I think the clothes punctuate that Ellen doesn't belong to the human world. Von Franz tells her that she is born into the occult, whereas he is a tourist. And even more interestingly, Von Franz is seen in the final scene of the movie in a mirror as opposed to head-on. So why do we see his face reflected in this way? Perhaps because he is a tourist in the world of the occult. Mirrors, as portals to another world, reflect a Von Franz beyond the veil, triumphant in spirit as his physical human body is engulfed by healing sunshine. Nosferatu is a myriad of metaphors, and yet the truth is always staring us squarely in the face, a face which is reflected in a mirror of inference while standing plainly in the sun. Even the cat, a symbol of femininity for many cultures, lurks in Ellen's room without a mistress or master, scooped up at the end of the movie by Von Franz himself. The cat is gray, Ellen's color palette, and seems to appear as the Nosferatu eyes, quite literally a symbol of the freedom of femininity and the duplicitousness of the moon. The sunlight is clarifying, bringing and truth. Ellen's soul is free at last. Her femininity is no longer bound, without a mistress or master, to the conventions of the earth. The characters are seemingly tourists in Ellen's metaphysical world, experiencing from the outside a complicated infatuation triangle, strained by assault and the violation of Ellen's consent. Even as Ellen takes her dying breaths, having lured the Nosferatu to her bedchamber to await the morning sun, Orlok's definition of having sex with her is simply draining her of blood throughout the night, and in order to keep him stationary enough to kill him, she requests that he inflicts even more pain despite being on the edge. The metaphor is very powerful. Even Herr Nock, a departure from the 1922 film, asks to be killed by being staked through the heart, so as to avoid living another moment under the grips of Count Orlok. Death absolves us of pain. But Nosferatu is a story about redemption, right? Ellen ultimately murders Orlok, she kills the aggressor, her wrist, she wins the ultimate battle, even though the final shot of the movie shows her and the monster who has infested her body, mind, and soul to be intermingled, entangled together. They stay together, ultimately inseparable, even though she has consciously chosen to love Thomas, and so I will repeat to you that in the wake of these most serious of assaults, while we can move on to them, the trauma becomes so monstrously ingrained in us, so difficult to ignore in terms of the scope of impact they have on our personhood, that even if we've gotten revenge and consciously chosen to move on, they remain a part of us. There's an almost perpetual victimhood in the way so much of our future decisions will be made on the basis of these types of aggravated assault. Even once we're healed, they are that monstrous and that all-encompassing, and send that much of a ripple through our societies so as to infect its very nature and lead to the deaths and assault of others beyond ourselves. This is the thesis of Nosferatu. Ellen's sacrifice finally brings the sun, for the first time in the movie, shining viciously in triumph. The original 1922 movie calls this the triumphant rays of the living sun. And while we attempt to banish our own demons, our own Nosferatus, let us remember that our sacrifices to move beyond those horrors will too bring about the triumphant rays of a living sun for all the survivors who come after. Well, there's my Nosferatu review. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe it spoke to you. This one is a lot less of an endless romp through a ton of tangents. I wanted to release something on Halloween to prove I'm still alive, so here you go. Please stay tuned as I work on the production of a very long video essay, and hey, check out my Halloween art piece live right now on IG. If you're interested in hearing more from me, you can check out my second channel, Spaz After Dark. Check me out on IG at Spazatic Studios Creations, at TikTok, at SpacialSklero. Check out the free tier of Patreon for fun behind-the-scenes content, patreon.com/SpacialSklero, and I will be releasing a free base for all tiers, so do be on the lookout for that. As always, pingle that jingle, windle that spindle, and like, comment, and survive. Thank you to my lovely patrons. I will list all of you out by name at the end of the next video essay, but hey look, you're scrolling across the screen right now. Please accept a big spooky ookie thank you for your continued patronage. You guys are really the best, especially since I'm technically still on my mental health break, so thank you for being patient and believing in me, no matter what it is I'm going through. I will see you all real soon, so stay weird and spooky. Bye!